By the spring of 1781, the American Revolution was suffocating. 6 years of brutal, grinding warfare had bled the Continental Army dry. The initial euphoria of the Declaration of Independence had long since evaporated, replaced by the grim reality of frozen winters, empty stomachs, and a completely bankrupt Congress.
The paper currency printed to fund the rebellion was practically worthless. Inflation had spiraled so wildly out of control that a single pair of shoes cost hundreds of dollars. Continental soldiers, many of whom had not been paid in years, were reaching the breaking point. In January of that year, the Pennsylvania line mutinied. Days later, the New Jersey line followed suit. General George Washington was forced to execute his own men to restore order, but the underlying rot remained. The army was dissolving from the inside out.
"We are at the end of our tether," Washington wrote in a private, desperate letter to his emissaries in France. "And now or never, our deliverance must come."
He was not exaggerating. The British, recognizing the fragility of the American situation, had shifted their entire strategy. Unable to crush Washington's elusive army in the northern colonies, the British High Command in London ordered a massive pivot toward the south. They believed the southern colonies were teeming with loyalists, waiting only for the arrival of redcoats to rise up and restore the king's peace.
This sudden strategy was devastatingly effective. In 1780, the British captured Charleston, South Carolina, taking thousands of American soldiers prisoner in the worst rebel defeat of the entire war. They followed this triumph by obliterating another American army at the Battle of Camden. The Southern theater had become a slaughterhouse, and the man holding the butcher's knife was Lieutenant General Charles Lord Cornwallis. Cornwallis was the most aggressive, capable, and terrifying field commander the British had in America. Unlike his superior, Sir Henry Clinton, who preferred the safety and comfort of occupied New York City, Cornwallis was a predator. He believed that the only way to end the rebellion was to relentlessly hunt down the rebel armies and destroy their capacity to fight. But this aggressive instinct was about to set the stage for the greatest military disaster in British history. Despite his tactical victories, Cornwallis was bleeding his army white. The American forces in the South had been reorganized under the command of General Nathaniel Greene, a brilliant, self-taught Quaker from Rhode Island. Greene knew he could not beat Cornwallis in a stand-up European-style battle. Instead, he initiated a grueling campaign of attrition. Greene led Cornwallis on a massive, exhausting chase across the Carolinas. They fought savage, bloody engagements at places like Guilford Courthouse. While Cornwallis technically won the ground, the cost in British lives was catastrophic. The British general was winning the battles but losing the campaign. His supply lines were stretched to the breaking point, and the promised thousands of loyalist militia never materialized in the numbers he needed. Frustrated, exhausted, and acting against the explicit wishes of his commander in New York, Cornwallis made a fateful decision. He would abandon the Carolinas entirely. He believed that the rebel resistance in the South was being supplied and directed from the wealthy, populous colony of Virginia. If he could conquer Virginia, the rebellion would be severed in half, and the southern colonies would wither on the vine. In May of 1781, Cornwallis marched his army north into Virginia. He did not know it yet, but he had just walked into the trap that would cost him his army, his reputation, and his empire. While Cornwallis was carving a path of destruction through the southern countryside, George Washington was sitting outside New York City, staring at an impenetrable fortress. For 3 years, the British had occupied New York. Washington was obsessed with taking it back. He believed that a spectacular victory in New York would instantly end the war. But the British defenses, commanded by Sir Henry Clinton, were formidable, supported by the terrifying power of the Royal Navy. Washington's army, hovering just north of the city in the Hudson Highlands, was simply too weak to mount a siege. But Washington was no longer fighting alone. In 1778, the Kingdom of France had officially recognized the United States and entered the war against Great Britain. For the first 2 years, this alliance produced little more than missed opportunities and mutual frustration. But in the summer of 1780, the dynamic shifted fundamentally. An expeditionary force of over 5,000 elite French infantrymen landed in Newport, Rhode Island.
They were commanded by Jean-Baptiste Donatien de Vimeur, the Comte de Rochambeau. Rochambeau was a veteran of decades of European warfare. He was calculating, pragmatic, and immensely experienced in the complex science of siege warfare. He was also placed under the direct command of George Washington, a massive concession by the French king, Louis XVI.
Rochambeau respected Washington, but he did not share the American commander's obsession with New York. When the two generals met to plan the campaign for 1781, tensions simmered beneath the polite diplomatic veneer. Washington presented his grand plan for a combined Franco-American assault on Manhattan. Rochambeau listened politely, but his engineers had already scouted the British defenses. They quietly informed their commander that an attack on New York would be a suicidal bloodbath. Rochambeau saw another option. He knew that Cornwallis was operating in Virginia. He also knew that a British army in Virginia would need to be supplied by the sea. If the Allies could trap Cornwallis against the coast, and if a French fleet could block the Royal Navy from rescuing him, they could achieve a decisive victory.
But everything depended on the fleet. And the fleet was currently 2,000 miles away in the Caribbean.
The French West Indies fleet was commanded by Admiral François-Joseph Paul de Grasse. De Grasse was a massive, imposing man with a fiery temper and a brilliant tactical mind. His primary mission was to protect the immensely profitable French sugar islands in the Caribbean from the British. But his orders also allowed him a brief window to sail north and assist the Americans before the hurricane season arrived.
In the summer of 1781, Rochambeau sent a frantic dispatch to De Grasse in the West Indies. He outlined the strategic situation. He told the admiral that he could sail his fleet to New York to support Washington's preferred attack, or he could sail to the Chesapeake Bay in Virginia, where Cornwallis was currently operating. The choice was left to the admiral.
On August 14th, 1781, George Washington was at his headquarters when a message arrived from the coast. He broke the seal and read the words that would change the trajectory of world history. Admiral De Grasse had made his decision. He was bringing his entire fleet, 28 ships of the line, 3,000 troops, and massive amounts of artillery and silver to the Chesapeake Bay. He would arrive in early September. However, De Grasse was explicitly clear. He could only stay until mid-October. After that, the hurricane season and his obligations in the Caribbean would force him to leave. Washington had a window of exactly 8 weeks to win the American Revolution. The obsession with New York was instantly abandoned. The grand strategy was set. The Allied armies would march 400 miles south to Virginia, link up with De Grasse, and crush Cornwallis before the British High Command realized what was happening. It was one of the most audacious, logistically terrifying, and brilliant gambles in military history. To make this march, Washington had to deceive the British commander in New York, Sir Henry Clinton. If Clinton realized that Washington and Rochambeau were moving south, he could easily sail out of New York Harbor, arrive in Virginia in a matter of days, and either reinforce Cornwallis or evacuate him entirely. The entire American army had to vanish, and they had to do it in plain sight. Washington orchestrated a masterpiece of military deception. He ordered his engineers to build massive, highly visible bake ovens facing New York, ovens large enough to feed tens of thousands of men. He arranged for false intelligence to be leaked to known British spies, confirming that an assault on Manhattan was imminent. He even ordered his troops to build pontoon bridges pointing directly toward the British lines. Meanwhile, behind this elaborate theatrical production, the main body of the Continental Army and the French Expeditionary Force began to slip away. They marched south in separate columns, maintaining absolute radio silence before the invention of radios. The logistics were staggering. Over 7,000 men, thousands of horses, hundreds of artillery pieces, and miles of supply wagons had to be moved down the eastern seaboard in the dead of summer.
The roads were little more than dirt paths, churning into suffocating dust under the boots of the infantry.
For weeks, Sir Henry Clinton sat behind his massive fortifications in New York, watching the fake bake ovens smoke, completely unaware that his enemy was evaporating. By the time Clinton realized he had been duped, the Allied armies had already crossed the Delaware River. They were passing through Philadelphia, greeted by cheering throngs. It was too late to stop them. The jaws of the trap were beginning to close. While Washington and Rochambeau were marching south, Cornwallis was making his own fateful moves in Virginia. For months, he had been engaged in a cat-and-mouse game with a small American force, commanded by the Marquis de Lafayette. Lafayette was a young, insanely wealthy French aristocrat who had defied his own king to fight for the American cause. He revered Washington like a father. Despite his youth, Lafayette played a brilliant tactical game in Virginia. He refused to give Cornwallis a pitched battle, instead shadowing the British army, harassing their foragers, and keeping a watchful eye on their movements. Cornwallis eventually received direct orders from Sir Henry Clinton in New York. Clinton, nervous about a potential French attack, ordered Cornwallis to establish a deep-water naval port on the Virginia Peninsula. From this port, Cornwallis could easily be resupplied, reinforced, or evacuated by the Royal Navy. Cornwallis surveyed the peninsula and settled on a small, prosperous tobacco port situated on a high bluff overlooking a broad river. The town was called Yorktown. In early August, the British Army marched into the town and began to dig in. They expelled the local residents, leveled the surrounding houses to clear fields of fire, and constructed a massive semicircle of earthen fortifications, known as Redouts, around the perimeter. Cornwallis felt entirely secure. His back was to the York River, providing a highway straight to the Atlantic Ocean. He had deep water for the Royal Navy. He had 7,000 veteran troops. All he had to do was wait for the British fleet to arrive from New York. He did not realize that the ocean behind him was about to become his tomb. On August 30th, the horizon beyond the Chesapeake Bay darkened with sails. But the flags flying from the masts were not the Union Jack. It was the massive French fleet under Admiral De Grasse. De Grasse immediately blockaded the mouth of the bay. He unloaded his 3,000 troops to reinforce Lafayette, effectively sealing Cornwallis off from the land. The trap was half set. But the British were not going to surrender control of the American coastline without a fight. Just days later, a British fleet commanded by Admiral Thomas Graves arrived from New York. Graves had been sent to find the French, destroy them, and relieve Cornwallis. When he reached the mouth of the Chesapeake, he was shocked to find a French fleet that significantly outnumbered his own. What followed, on September 5th, 1781, was the Battle of the Capes. It is perhaps the most important naval battle in history, where no Americans fought. As the British fleet approached, De Grasse ordered his ships to slip their cables and sail out to meet them. The two massive lines of wooden warships converged in the Atlantic. For hours, they pounded each other with thousands of heavy iron cannonballs. Wood splintered, masts shattered, and men were torn apart by flying shrapnel. Tactically, the battle was a bloody draw, but strategically, it was a total, absolute victory for the French. After days of maneuvering and staring each other down, the heavily damaged British fleet turned around and sailed back to New York to repair. Admiral Graves abandoned the waters of Virginia. By doing so, he abandoned Cornwallis. The Royal Navy, the undisputed master of the oceans, had failed. The sea route was permanently closed. Cornwallis was now completely, utterly trapped. By late September, Washington and Rochambeau arrived in Williamsburg, just a few miles from Yorktown. The Allied armies merged, bringing their total strength to over 16,000 men, nearly 9,000 Americans and 8,000 French. For the first time in the entire war, George Washington had a massive numerical advantage over his enemy. On September 28th, the combined Allied army marched out of Williamsburg and surrounded Yorktown. A siege in the 18th century was a highly mathematical, formalized, and lethal engineering operation. It was not a chaotic brawl.
It was a slow, inevitable strangulation. And the French were the undisputed masters of this deadly art. Rochambeau's engineers, led by the brilliant Marquis de Chastellux, surveyed the ground and mapped out the British defences. To destroy Yorktown, the Allies had to move their massive siege cannons close enough to batter the British earthworks to dust. But they could not simply roll the cannons across an open field. The British artillery would annihilate them. Instead, they had to dig their way to the enemy. On the night of October 6th, under the cover of utter darkness and a freezing rain, thousands of Allied soldiers crept into the no-man's land outside Yorktown. They carried shovels, pickaxes, and massive bundles of sticks known as fascines. Working in absolute silence, under the constant threat of discovery, they began to dig. They were constructing the first parallel, a trench over a mile long, running parallel to the British defences, located just 800 yards away. It was a Herculean effort. By the time the sun rose, the trench was deep enough to conceal the men. When the British defenders looked out from their earthworks the next morning, they were horrified. Where there had been an empty field the day before, a massive fortified trench had miraculously appeared. The siege had officially begun. For 2 days, the Allies laboured in the trenches, dragging their heavy siege artillery into position. The French had brought massive 24-pounder cannons, mortars and howitzers. On the afternoon of October 9th, the preparations were complete. Tradition dictated that the commanding general fire the first shot. George Washington stepped up to an American cannon. He touched the match to the touch hole. The massive gun roared, sending an iron ball tearing across the field. It reportedly smashed directly into a house where British officers were dining, killing the British Commissary General. It was the signal for the apocalypse to begin. Over the next several days, the Allied artillery unleashed a continuous, devastating bombardment. Dozens of cannons fired day and night without pause. The French artillerymen were incredibly precise. They utilized ricochet fire, bouncing the cannonballs across the ground so they would skip over the British earthworks and tear through the men hiding behind them. Massive mortars lobbed explosive shells high into the air. The shells, trails of sparking fuses glowing against the night sky, plummeted into Yorktown and detonated with terrifying concussive force. The town of Yorktown was reduced to a splintered, smoking ruin. Buildings collapsed. The ground shook constantly. The psychological toll on the British defenders, trapped in dirt trenches with explosive shells raining down on them 24 hours a day, was unimaginable. "We are completely enveloped," a Hessian soldier fighting for the British wrote in his diary. "The enemy's fire is so heavy that we cannot show a finger above the parapet." In a display of sheer patriotic resolve, Thomas Nelson Jr., the American governor of Virginia and a militia commander, noticed that the Allied gunners were avoiding aiming at a large, prominent brick mansion in the town. When he asked why, the artillerymen replied that they believed it was Nelson's own home, and they did not want to destroy his property. Nelson immediately ordered them to turn their guns on the house, suspecting that Cornwallis was using it as his headquarters. He offered a reward to the first gunner who could hit his own home. The house was swiftly pummeled, but firing from the first parallel was not enough. To force a surrender, the Allies needed to move their cannons even closer, to a second parallel, just 300 yards from the British lines. There was only one problem. The path to the second parallel was blocked by two massive detached British earthworks pushed out ahead of their main line. They were known simply by their numbers: Redoubt 9 and Redoubt 10. Before the Allies could dig the second parallel, these redoubts had to be destroyed. The assault on the redoubts was scheduled for the night of October 14th. It was to be a simultaneous, coordinated attack. The French forces would assault the larger, heavily defended Redoubt 9. The American light infantry would take Redoubt 10. The command of the American assault fell to a young, fiercely ambitious lieutenant colonel who had been begging Washington for a field command for years. His name was Alexander Hamilton.
Hamilton knew this was his moment to secure glory and cement his legacy. He was given command of 400 elite light infantrymen. The orders given to the assault forces were chilling. To ensure absolute silence during the approach, the soldiers were forbidden from loading their muskets. If a man panicked and fired into the dark, it would alert the British and slaughter the entire column.
This attack would be carried out entirely with the bayonet.
At 8 p.m., a French mortar fired 6 glowing shells into the night sky, the signal to advance.
Hamilton and his men emerged from the trenches and sprinted across the dark, cratered landscape. As they neared Redoubt 10, the British sentries spotted them. A blinding volley of musket fire tore into the American ranks. Men screamed and fell, but the column did not stop. They reached the abatis, a defensive perimeter of sharpened trees resembling deadly wooden antlers. Pioneers wielding axes desperately hacked away the heavy timber. Hamilton, refusing to wait, climbed onto the shoulders of one of his men and vaulted over the sharpened branches. The Americans swarmed into the ditch and clawed their way up the steep dirt walls of the redoubt. The fighting was vicious, intimate, and pitch black. Men stabbed, clubbed, and strangled each other in the mud. The British defenders, overwhelmed by the sheer ferocity and speed of the American assault, broke and surrendered. Hamilton had taken Redoubt 10 in less than 10 minutes. To their left, the French assault on Redoubt 9 was a bloodier, more drawn-out affair. The Hessian defenders fought fanatically, pouring fire into the French ranks while they struggled to clear the defensive obstacles. But French discipline held. Led by the Count de Deux Ponts, the French infantry forced their way over the parapet, engaging in brutal hand-to-hand combat until the garrison finally threw down their weapons.
The redoubts had fallen.
Before the blood was even dry on the earthworks, Allied engineers were rushing forward, incorporating the captured positions into the new second parallel. By morning, Cornwallis looked out and realized the Allied cannons were now staring directly down his throat. Cornwallis was a fighter. He was not going to capitulate without exploring every single avenue of survival. With the second parallel complete, the Allied artillery fire intensified to a deafening, apocalyptic roar. The British artillery was almost entirely silenced. Disease, particularly smallpox and camp fever, was ravaging the British ranks. On the night of October 16th, Cornwallis attempted one last desperate gamble. He decided to abandon his sick and wounded, load his able-bodied soldiers into small boats, and row them across the mile-wide York River to the town of Gloucester Point. If he could break through the small Allied force holding that side of the river, he could theoretically march north and escape into Maryland. It was a suicidal plan, but it was his only option. Under the cover of darkness, the first wave of British troops boarded the boats and rowed across the black waters of the river. They landed safely on the opposite shore. The boats returned to pick up the second wave. But as the men pushed off the banks of Yorktown, the sky above them fractured. A violent, unseasonal squall descended on the Virginia Peninsula. Hurricane-force winds ripped across the river. The flat-bottomed boats were violently tossed, spun around, and blown miles downriver. Men scrambled desperately to bail water as the waves crashed over the gunwales. The crossing was entirely aborted. The men who had already crossed were stranded. The men left behind were doomed. The storm was the final, definitive nail in the coffin. The next morning, October 17th, the Allied bombardment resumed with terrifying intensity. The British defences were crumbling like sand castles in the tide. At 10 a.m., through the smoke and the deafening roar of the guns, the Allied troops saw a lone figure climb onto the battered British parapet. It was a young drummer boy, dressed in a red coat, beating his drum. No one could hear him over the thunder of the artillery, but the visual signal was unmistakable. A British officer climbed up beside the boy, waving a white handkerchief. The firing slowed, rippling down the line until, for the first time in weeks, absolute silence descended on the Virginia Peninsula. The battle was over.
The British Empire had asked for terms. The negotiations took 2 days. Washington's demands were absolute and uncompromising. He demanded the unconditional surrender of the entire British army. Furthermore, he denied the British the traditional honours of war. Usually, a surrendering army was allowed to march out with their colours flying and their bands playing an enemy tune, a sign of mutual respect between professionals. But a year earlier, when the American army surrendered at Charleston, the British had humiliated them, denying them these very honours. Washington, harbouring a deep and unforgiving memory, ordered that the British must march out with their colours cased and their bands playing a British or German march. The humiliation was to be returned in full. The surrender ceremony took place on the afternoon of October 19th, 1781. The scene was painted into the memory of every man who witnessed it. The Allied armies lined up along a road leading out of Yorktown. It was a stunning visual contrast. On one side stood the French army, immaculate in pristine white uniforms, perfectly aligned, the picture of European military perfection. On the other side stood the Continental Army. They were dressed in rags, hunting shirts, and mismatched coats. They were muddy, starving, and exhausted, but they stood impossibly tall. Between these two lines marched the defeated British army. Over 7,000 men threw down their weapons in a massive pile. According to legend, the British bands played a melancholy tune called "The World Turned Upside Down." Whether they played that specific song or not, the sentiment was entirely accurate. Lord Cornwallis, the great predator of the South, could not bring himself to face the humiliation. Claiming to be sick with an illness, he hid in his tent. He sent his second-in-command, Brigadier General Charles O'Hara, to surrender his sword. O'Hara rode down the line. Seeking to insult the Americans one last time, he bypassed George Washington entirely and rode directly toward the Comte de Rochambeau, attempting to surrender the sword to the French. Rochambeau coldly shook his head and pointed across the road. "You are mistaken," the French general said. "The commander-in-chief of our army is to the right." O'Hara was forced to wheel his horse around and face George Washington. He offered the sword. Washington, recognizing the diplomatic insult of a subordinate attempting to surrender to a commander-in-chief, refused to touch it. He pointed to his own second-in-command, Major General Benjamin Lincoln, the exact man who had been humiliated by the British at the surrender of Charleston. Lincoln accepted the sword, held it for a moment, and then handed it back to O'Hara. The transfer of power was complete. The most powerful empire on the planet had been defeated by a ragtag army of farmers, shoemakers, and ideologues, backed by the wealth and naval power of France. When the news of Yorktown reached London, the British Prime Minister, Lord North, is said to have thrown his arms in the air and paced the room wildly, screaming, "Oh God, it is all over!" He was right. While scattered skirmishes would continue for another year, the political will of the British people to fight the war evaporated. The loss of a second entire field army was a catastrophic blow to the national treasury and the national pride. The King's parliamentary majority collapsed. The government sued for peace. 2 years later, the Treaty of Paris was signed, legally recognizing the independence of the United States of America. The victory at Yorktown was not simply a military triumph. It was a miracle of logistics, diplomacy, and timing. If De Grasse had been delayed by a week, if Clinton had moved a day sooner, if the storm had not blown the British boats downriver, the entire American experiment could have died on that peninsula. It required the unyielding endurance of the continental soldier, the unparalleled engineering and naval might of the French, and the audacious, gambling genius of George Washington. Yorktown broke the chains of empire. It proved that a colonial uprising could dismantle the greatest military machine of the age. It sent shockwaves across the Atlantic, directly inspiring the French Revolution just a decade later, and lighting a fire of democratic republicanism that would eventually consume the globe. The guns have been silent for 2.5 centuries. The trenches have been covered by grass.
But the ground at Yorktown still holds the weight of that miraculous autumn. The exact moment when a fragile, desperate rebellion transformed into a sovereign nation.